I'm honored to be asked to even come because it's truthfully humbling to think that there's anything that I could say that would actually be helpful to you as an operational firefighter. I spent a lot of years kind of in the seats that you're in right now. And again, it's really humbling to me to think that there's anything that just through words that I could convey to you, they're going to help you do your jobs better. So that's kind of the mark that I'm trying to shoot for. Hopefully I can get close to it, and again, just to realize that I'm honored to be asked to come. So here's an outline kind of what I'm going to talk about. Relevant should maybe be in quotation marks, because you get to decide whether it's relevant or not. We'll talk about some relevant research that we've had going on at the University of Montana, and then we will take a break. And at least from my own experience, maybe the most beneficial parts of these trainings are the actual breaks that happen. I mean, that's where you get to interface, that's where you get to talk to people. I would just ask that at some point during some of those breaks, step outside your comfort zone. Go up and talk to somebody that you haven't met before. Go meet people that you don't know. Like Mike said, folks that you might interface with at some point. It's real easy to hang with the folks that you know. It's a little bit tougher to make that next step and go reach out to people that you might work with, but you don't necessarily know right now. So we'll take that break kind of about halfway through, and then when we come back, I'll talk about some things related to situational awareness. So that's kind of the quick outline of what I'm going to cover. So realize that at the University of Montana, we've been fortunate for 50 plus years. We've had this relationship with Missoula Technology and Development Center. The people, Joe Dimitrovich is going to come and talk to you after me. That's where Joe is from MTDC. So we've been fortunate to have this 50-year plus relationship with them where they provide us funding and they have research questions, or they are willing to fund some of the research questions that we have in reference to wildland firefighters and how they do their job. So I got fortunate 12 years ago to be able to leave the fire line and slide into a job at U of M, where I continued then to get to work with firefighters, because that's really what my interest is and my passion. And if you don't know kind of what MTDC has done, they're the folks that are involved with all sorts of really, really interesting research, whether it be the change from the old traditional sack lunch to now the new shift food lunch. Some people love it, some people hate it, but those are the sorts of things that MTDC is involved in. Tools, work design, all sorts of things. That's not a comprehensive list, but just gives you a little idea of some of the different things that they've been involved with over the course of 50 plus years now. What I will tell you is that from a broad research perspective, we know a fair amount about fire behavior. We've been studying fire behavior for a really, really long time. How fuels, how topography, how weather, how all of those things influence what fire does. I'm not here to say or try and convince you that we know everything that there's possibly is to know about fire behavior, but we know a fair amount about it. What we don't know nearly as much about is how humans then figure into this equation when we either have to go out and deal with this fire as an operational firefighter or as a member of the public that is being impacted by this fire that's happening. We know a whole lot less about that part of the process. So that's why we kind of have some of the research interests and questions that we do have. You might recognize that picture. That's 1994. That's the back of the head of Missoula smoke jumper Sabino Sonny Archuleta. That picture was taken by Missoula smoke jumper Sarah Doring. So that's the South Canyon fire in Colorado, 1994, where unfortunately 14 folks were killed. It sucks, but again, as Mike said, the job that we do has risk to it, and one of the consequences of that risk at times is that some of our brothers and sisters get hurt or killed doing the job. So that's looking down on the west flank fire line. Luckily enough for Sabino and Sarah, they were far enough upslope to be able to get out of there unscathed, but you can see how close even they were to what was coming. And we know then that there were 12 folks down there. There was 9 hot shots, 3 smoke jumpers, and then 2 helitack folks were killed later farther up the hill. But that's an unfortunate consequence of the work that we do. But one of the things that this did is it kind of birthed the human factors movement. We didn't know a whole lot about how humans interface with fire. We knew a whole lot more about it after this event because it served as the genesis for a lot of really positive change. Ted Putnam is the person who was the initiator of that initial change. Ted was one of the people on the investigation committee. Again, if you are a student of fire or like to follow some of this stuff, you might remember that Ted was the one person who didn't sign the investigation report. He was on the investigation team, and eventually as that team came out with its findings, Ted said, I'm not going to put my name on that. I don't think it's gone far enough in terms of diving into the human factors that contributed to, unfortunately, those 14 folks getting killed. So Ted then, a year later, pulled together this human factors conference right here at the University of Montana to try and bring in people, operators, academicians, folks with an interest and an ability and a skill set to be able to understand a little bit more about what happens when humans interface with fire. And thus we have then this first human factors workshop. And here are the findings then that are published. If you don't know, human factors is this really long, interesting list of different things, and this is by no means comprehensive, but this just gives you a little bit of taste of what that means when you hear this kind of nebulous term of human factors and what that might imply. It's some really, really interesting things here in terms of how we as humans act, especially in high-risk situations. This is one of the key findings then that was written up from that workshop, which is, I'm not going to read it here for you word for word, other than the last part, which is that, and this in turn requires a thorough examination of the human dimensions of wildland firefighting. We need to do a better job of understanding what happens then when we are tasked with going out and dealing with some of these incidents. And like I said, we didn't have a great understanding of that before. So we're now 24 years post South Canyon, and there's been a lot of really, really positive changes that have occurred because of what happened that day. We've got the leadership curriculum, we've got staff rides that are further developed, we've got all sorts of really, really positive outgrowth from South Canyon. So when I got the job at the University of Montana in 2006, I was working for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at that point. I had left jumping, I was trying to build my prescribed fire quals a little bit. The Fish and Wildlife Service was the best place I felt for me to do that, so I moved out to Minnesota of all places, in the Twin Cities, so it was really interesting to try and do prescribed burns in a major metropolitan area. So it was a great opportunity, I thought, to be able to work on that. Eventually, then I threw in an app at the University of Montana, not thinking by any means that they would hire me, but they were foolish enough to hire me in '06. And so I left the fire line and went there, but what I brought with me then was all these questions that I had from nearly 20 years of doing what it is that you folks do. And one of the first things that I had in terms of questions was this kind of personal understanding that the job was kind of difficult on some of my personal relationships at times. I had some failed relationships that oftentimes I felt that my job as a wildland firefighter contributed to the failure of those relationships. And so I thought, well, why not try and investigate that a little bit further? And so I just surveyed a whole bunch of operational firefighters just to see what they would say, to find out what kind of information that they had. And you can see some of the results then that came out of that, which I thought were kind of interesting oftentimes. Some of them were kind of intuitive, but some of them weren't nearly as intuitive. I think it's a no-brainer that adjusting to our schedules is tough if you're in a relationship with somebody, and especially if they're not a firefighter. That's tough to just say, you know what, I might see you tonight, I might not. It might be 2 weeks or more before I see you again, or I might see you in 2 weeks and be home for a couple days and then be gone again. That can be tough, but I don't think that's a real head scratcher. I think most of us kind of understand that. It's a question whether the people that we're in relationships with understand that or not. Maintaining those relationships can be difficult. If we educate our partners early on, that helps. Again, that's a good finding, but I don't think that's probably a surprise. Date another firefighter was what a lot of firefighters told me, which is cool because then that person understands your schedule, but at the same time now you both have that same schedule, which can make it real tough to kind of have quality time together because our schedules are so dynamic. Find partners who are independent. That I thought was interesting, right? Somebody who's not overly reliant on you, who has a life of their own so that when you leave and your schedule kind of pulls you away, that person has their own life and their own existence, and they're able to deal with you being gone. And then the last one, which is maximize your time off, so that whether that be the winter or whenever, when you're finally back together and the season has slowed down, unfortunately our seasons don't seem to slow down much anymore, but when that does happen, boom, we maximize that time off. We go on a trip together, we spend a whole bunch of concentrated time with one another to kind of reconnect and rekindle the relationship. So that was kind of my first foray into the research world, because as you get a job in higher ed, they kind of expect that you're going to do something from a research standpoint. I was like, what am I going to do? I don't really know anything other than what I've been doing for nearly 20 years. So that kind of started my research agenda. The other thing that I was fascinated with was, as a graduate student, I did my dissertation with ADHD. Student athletes with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. I have some attentional challenges myself, so my lens has always kind of been geared towards ADHD. And one of the things I found interesting was that it seemed like a lot of the folks that I worked with in fire had some attentional challenges. And if you think about what's the classic diagnosis of ADHD consist of, well, it's impulsivity, which is doing things without necessarily thinking them all the way through. It's distractibility, and I can be doing something and then boom, be pulled away from that very easily and very quickly. And then for some people, there's a hyperactivity or an overactivity component to that. And so again, being a firefighter for a long time, I saw a lot of people that I worked with that had those kind of traits. And so, well, is there any way to measure that? Well, there is a way to measure that. There's a really reliable and valid screener that exists. It's called the Adult Self-Report Scale version 1.1 of ADHD, which you can take, and it kicks you out a score. And if you are at or above that cutoff score, it suggests, it doesn't diagnose, but it suggests strongly that you might have the characteristics consistent with ADHD. So we were working on another project with Joe out in the field. So we simply brought this screener with us, which afforded us the opportunity then to interface with 300 plus firefighters out on incidents. Various resource types, team members, hotshots, smoke jumpers, engine crews, type 2s. We had a really good diverse mix then in our sample. And of those 302 people that we talked to, nearly 20% of them were at or above the cutoff score. The normal rate is about 4 to 5% in the regular population. So here, in our sample of 300 plus firefighters, they were about 4 times what the research would suggest is the average rate. So a little bit of evidence that, yes, we are perhaps a population with a higher propensity for behaviors that are consistent with ADHD. I don't want to say that 20% of all firefighters have ADHD. That wouldn't be accurate. I think it's much more safe to say we are a population that seems to deal with some attentional related challenges. My theory is that it's beneficial. That we have gravitated towards occupations where our challenges are actually not challenges at all, but actually complements, things that work. Just think about it. If you have a high motor, you're comfortable being on the move, you're comfortable with risk, because the research is real consistent that people with ADHD are very comfortable in risky environments. And that you're able to focus, because that's a strange misnomer about ADHD, is people with ADHD actually have a tremendous ability to focus as long as whatever they're focusing on is interesting to them, to the point where they can really effectively shut out all sorts of other things. So I think it's a benefit. I think we have gravitated to fields, in this case fire, where our strengths are having an opportunity to be realized. I think it's probably, if you were to sample other high-risk occupations, military, law enforcement, I think the rate's probably high there as well. That's just a theory. Stress. We were funded by Joe's group then to look at stress, both in incident management teams and in dispatchers. Dispatchers are forgotten in all this loop. Anybody ever been in a dispatch role at any point? Tough work. We don't think nearly as much about those folks as we probably should, because that's a super tough job. I think at times we tend to just stick people in dispatch because we think they can't do anything else. But I think that's a fallacy. That's the people in dispatch need to be some of our best and brightest, I think. But let's look at the IMTs first. When we asked them about stress, we did this from all sorts of different data points. So we got salivary cortisol, we got stress inventories, we did personal one-on-one interviews. We tried to get as much data as we could from them about what it was about their jobs that were stressful. And again, some of those seem pretty sensible, make sense, and other ones are kind of like, wow, I wouldn't have thought that. So actually, people on teams handle stress really well, and what they consistently told us was that their regular jobs were a whole lot more stressful than their team jobs. They really loved going out on the team. They didn't necessarily love as much whatever their regular job was back at home. They felt like their teamwork was oftentimes a vacation from all the shit, pardon my French, that they had to deal with whatever their regular job was. They don't sleep very much. About 6 hours a night on average, but a lot of them were running on 3 to 4 hours of sleep. I don't know how you can do that. As I've gotten older, sleep has gotten way more important to me. I don't know how you would do the jobs that they do on the minimal amount of sleep that they have. I think sleep is probably the area we know the least about, but perhaps has the greatest impact on our performance overall. And yet we just don't really have a great understanding of how detrimental a lack of sleep might be in our overall performance. Stress varies by tempo. The run-up, the initial attack part, the early part of the incidents are oftentimes the most stressful. That makes sense. Then it tends to get to a kind of a plateau, and then that stress spikes again either at demob or when that team is looking to transition that thing off to somebody else. That seems to make sense, but stress does one of these things typically for team members. And then the last part of it is we have self-inflicted stress generated by our own organizations. Policies and procedures and rules and things that we handicap or handcuff ourselves with oftentimes lead to more stress than anything else, which you would think, oh, we could maybe fix that. And then on the right, the dispatchers, here's folks that feel like they're connected to the job all the time through the cell phone, through the pager, that on very short notice they're expected to go back to work again. They have a real tough time with work-life balance. Here's my work life, here's my personal life. These folks, at least based on what they've told us, felt like those two overlapped a lot with one another, and it was tough to have separate lives away from work. That's tough to do that. As you can see, other things up there as far as what stressed them out, it might be computer programs, it might be work setups as far as being super close to all the people that you work with. And then how do they deal with it? Exercise. That's key. Take time off. Figure out how to get away from the job if possible and just leave everything behind, even if it means sacrificing some of that holy overtime that we all kind of cherish. And then lastly, receiving support from one another. They have really tremendous social support systems where they're able to help one another kind of through some of those difficult times. We followed up on sleep a little bit to try and learn more about it. Like I said, I think we've barely scratched the surface. We somewhat validated the findings from the dispatcher study, about 6 hours of sleep on average a night. If you get stuck with a night shift, you're going to get even less sleep, at least if these results are true. So realize that if you happen to be on an incident that has one of these rare things that's called a night shift, it's going to be very, very tough for you to get any quality sleep during the day, because you know how camps look. It's bright out, it's noisy. People don't really understand or realize that there might be folks sleeping. The teams are doing a better job of trying to segregate those folks so that they have some better environments to try and get that sleep. But again, just start thinking about the cumulative effects of really getting 3 or 4 or 5 hours of sleep night after night after night. That is not a great setup for working in a risky environment. And then I'll leave you with this heading into our first break. So again, probably a picture that a lot of you recognize. This is Christopher McKenzie, was the photographer. So he's one of the members, was one of the members of Granite Mountain. And again, hopefully you follow this stuff. Hopefully you're a consumer of what's going on out there from a wildfire standpoint, especially a consumer when, again, our brothers and sisters pay the ultimate price and get killed doing what they do. It's on us to learn as much as we can when that happens. And so here we have them and all these shots and photos and video that kind of show the lead up to what we all know meant eventually the 19 of them ended up there. Why? We don't know. We don't know. So my argument, or my point, being that we learned a lot from 1994 in South Canyon. All these positive downstream impacts, all these great rollout effects. It sucks, 14 people died, but those folks helped make our jobs better and safer through some of the findings that we gained and learned from that. My point is that we haven't done the same with Yarnell. We're 4+ years out. And what do we really know about Yarnell other than don't be Eric Marsh? Don't be somebody who leaves the black and ends up in front of a headfire. That's not a great finding. That's not super helpful to just say, don't be that dude or don't be that crew. That doesn't really tell us anything. So this lingering kind of challenge sits with all of us in terms of what can we take from that? What can we learn from that event? Because that's kind of, how many folks were fighting fire in 2014, right? A lot of you. Unfortunately, we have these seminal fires. If you do this job long enough, you have these seminal fires that happen where it's like it's not one or two. We lose 17 to 18 people a year. Since 1990, that's the average. 17 to 18 people a year die doing what it is that you do. And some years, unfortunately, that spikes. Some years it's lower, but the average is about 17 to 18 people a year. Here's 19 in one incident. It's on us to learn as much as we can about that when that happens. But again, we don't know that much, unfortunately. But there's people who are trying, so stay tuned. But at this point, it's still something that we're trying to gain from and learn from. And what I will tell you, as far as thoughts go, it'd be great if Yarnell served as the kind of launching point that South Canyon did in terms of our understanding of human factors. It hasn't so far, but hopefully it will. It'll move past the mindset of don't be that dude and you'll be fine. But what I will tell you is we are going to be tempted, and we are tempted, to believe that technology is going to solve most, if not all, of our human factors problems. Whether it's a drone or a piece of wearable technology or an app or whatever it might be, we're tempted or we're led to believe by other people that these technological advancements are going to fix our human factors challenges. And I'm going to piss on your parade and tell you that it's not going to happen. If anything, in some ways it might make our jobs a little bit easier and a little bit safer, but in a lot of ways it's going to make what we do even more complicated. Because all that is data. Who manages that data? Who's in charge of that data? Who's in charge of utilizing it, pulling it together so that it makes sense, and then kicking it out to the field in a format that helps them do their jobs more safely and more effectively? But there's money behind all of that, right? I mean, the International Association of Wildland Fire Conference was just here last week, 600+ fire professionals from around the world. And of all the offerings that happened at that conference, what dominated the presentations was this sort of stuff. I'm not completely saying that this is wrong, but I am saying that we need to take all of this with a grain of salt, because ultimately, it still has to run through us. Whatever it is that this data, whatever comes out of it, it has to run through us as a firefighter. One of my colleagues, Brent Ruby, says, until robots replace you, we're going to have human factors issue. And I don't see robots doing what we do anytime soon, if ever. So despite all of these advancements, all of that has to come through a human operator at the ground level, at an administrative or a supervisory level, at a remote level, wherever it might be. It all has to come through human operators. And we are fantastic at what we do, but we're also fallible at the same time. That's human factors. All right, let's take a break. Let's say 5 minutes. We'll come back, utilize it, interface.